Bezos and McKinsey packed up the contents of their home and told the movers to just start driving their belongings across the country. They said they would call them on the road the next day with a specific destination. First, they flew to Fort Worth, Texas, and borrowed a 1988 Chevy Blazer from Bezos' father. Then they drove northwest, Bezos sitting in the passenger seat, typing revenue projections into an Excel spreadsheet, numbers that would later prove to be radically inaccurate. They tried to check into a Motel 6 in Shamrock, Texas, but it was booked. So they settled for a road motel called the Rambler. When McKinsey saw the room, she declined to take off her shoes that night. A day later, they stopped at the Grand Canyon and watched the sunrise. He was 30, she was 24, and together they were writing an entrepreneurial origin story that would be imprinted on the collective imagination of millions of internet users and hopeful startup founders. So that is an excerpt from the book, The Everything Store, Jeff Bezos and the Age of Amazon, written by Brad Stone in 2013. It's a fantastic book. And that story is from 1994 when Jeff Bezos and McKinsey are flying to Texas and then start driving northwest to find a home for their new company, which at the time isn't even called Amazon yet. It's actually called Cadabra. And a few months before this drive out west, Jeff had read that the internet had grown 2,300% from January of 1993 to January of 1994. So as most of us probably know, Jeff had this idea to start an online company, ride this wave that is the internet. And his idea was to start with an online bookstore, because an online bookstore could have a much broader and vast selection of books than any brick and mortar store ever could. And as we know today, over 30 years later, Amazon is the fourth largest company in the US. It's worth over $2.3 trillion. And so as I dove into this book, I had a bunch of questions. What was Jeff like as a child? What was he like when he started Amazon? What were the early days of Amazon like? What are the strategic moves they made along the way? How does Jeff think about the company, and what was his original vision for the company versus where did it end up being today? So just had a ton of questions, especially after reading and doing the podcast on Elon Musk and Steve Jobs. Jeff Bezos really seemed like a natural next step to dive into. And before I read this book, I was pretty familiar with Jeff Bezos. I'd read the book Invent and Wonder, which has all his shareholder letters and some more of his writing. And I'd watched some interviews with him. He was on the Lex Fridman podcast, which was fantastic. I'd highly recommend that. And watched a few other interviews with him. So I had a general feel for some of his principles, like long-term thinking and being customer obsessed. But I never really dove in on the story of Amazon or Jeff. So I was really looking forward to learning more about Jeff and Amazon and how he built this company from the early days to where it is today. And so what my protocol has kind of turned out to be for these podcasts is I'll listen to the audiobook, and as I'm listening to the audiobook, I will take notes on the book and just different ideas that come to mind, whether it's a leadership tactic or an important decision that is made. There's just a bunch of different notes that I'll take. And then once I've listened to the audiobook, I'll print out those notes and I'll kind of start trying to group them together to see, hey, what are the common themes that I'm seeing here? What are the common ideas and lessons that I want to spend a little bit more time diving in on their stories and understanding? And so that's how I landed, with Steve Jobs and Elon Musk and the Chesty Puller podcast. Each of those were like 14 lessons from Steve Jobs or 18 lessons from Elon Musk, right? And once I finished my notes, I actually ended up listening to this book twice. And when I went through my notes, I had 33 ideas and lessons from this book that I wanted to take the time to study after I had read. And so obviously 33 is far too many for me to try to cover in a single podcast. One, it would be a very long podcast. Two, it would take me a very long time to prepare that. So decided to take a different approach on today's podcast. Today, we're just going to dive into 6 of them. And it's going to be 6 stories that are all tied together through one common theme. And that idea comes from a guy named Alan Kay, who Jeff Bezos looked up to. And Alan Kay was a computer scientist who pioneered technology like object-oriented programming and the graphical user interface in the early days of computers. And this idea from Alan Kay is this idea that perspective is worth 80 IQ points, which means essentially the way you look at a problem, the lens that you look at the challenge or problem through, can help you understand that problem and frame it in a different light and allow you to come to better solutions. And so that is what I wanted to highlight today, because it's something that, as I've read these books about Steve Jobs, about Elon Musk, about Jeff Bezos, one of the really interesting things is to see how they look at these challenges and these problems and the lens that they look at them through, and how that differs from how other people see those same problems or challenges, right? Because at the end of the day, that's how these big companies get built. And that's why they are so unique, is because they have a unique way at looking at the challenges that we face already. And so while I'm going to cover 6 of the stories today that I think are really interesting and highlight this idea of perspective is worth 80 IQ points, there's so many more stories like this in the book where you can see, hey, this is how traditional people in the industry have thought about it. And this is how Jeff Bezos or whoever it is thinks about it, and why they came to a different conclusion on how they should act than everyone else in the industry. So that is what we are going to dive into today, these 6 stories that highlight that perspective is worth 80 IQ points. The first story I want to dive into today is actually where we started the podcast, and that's the story of starting Amazon. And so I had known before I dove into this book that Jeff Bezos had a good job before he started Amazon. I did not realize how good of a job he had and how well he was doing before he decided to leave that job and start Amazon. So before Amazon, Jeff was a senior vice president at a hedge fund called D.E. Shaw. It was a very successful hedge fund, and he was crushing it at the time. And he tells this story about when he goes to his boss to tell him that he wants to start Amazon. And he says his boss listens intently to him the entire time. And then at the end of it, his boss says, hey, this sounds like a really good idea, but it seems like it would be better for someone who didn't already have a good job. And so I did some digging, just trying to figure out, hey, how much was Jeff Bezos making at the time? And obviously it's not public information, but I used ChatGPT, and it looks like he probably would have been making around $200,000 as a base salary at the time, with an annual bonus between $300,000 and $500,000. And this is all in 1994 dollars. So if you adjust that for inflation, he's probably taking home in the realm of $1 million a year in today's money. And so you can see why his boss is telling him, hey, this sounds like a really good idea for someone who doesn't already have a good job. And so his boss tells him to take 48 hours to think about the decision and whether he wants to go through with it. And so Jeff Bezos talks about how he was searching to find the right framework to look at this decision through, right? Like, hey, I'm thinking about starting this company. What is the perspective that I want to take? What's the lens that I want to look at this decision through to help me make this really big decision in my life, whether I'm going to leave this very high paying job and go take a huge risk that will probably fail in building Amazon.com. And he talks about how he lands on this regret minimization framework. So here we go. This is Jeff Bezos talking. He says, I wanted to project myself forward to age 80 and think, okay, now I'm looking back on my life. I want to have minimized the number of regrets I have. I knew that at 80, I wouldn't regret having tried this. I wouldn't regret trying to participate in this thing called the internet, which I thought was going to be a really big deal. I knew that if I failed, I wouldn't regret that, but I knew the one thing I might regret was not ever having tried. That would haunt me every day. When I thought about it that way, it was an incredibly easy decision. And so I think, obviously, this framework of looking through things as, hey, what are the regrets you're going to have? I think that's a very useful frame. And it actually reminds me of something we talked about on the Steve Jobs podcast. This is from his commencement speech in 2005 at Stanford. He says, remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. So I thought that was really interesting. Steve calls this perspective the most important tool he's encountered for making the big choices in life. And obviously, this choice that Bezos is making is a very big choice. And so the reason I highlight this, I think this is one of those bits of wisdom that is one we've all heard before of, hey, what are you going to regret at the end of the road? Make decisions, follow your heart, that kind of advice. But I think it's one of those pieces of wisdom that's very easy for us to hear and for us to know, but it's a lot harder for us to actually act on and remember that perspective. I know for myself, that is a perspective that I forget to take into account all the time. There's so many times where I let things drag me down or be a big weight on me when I probably won't even remember them a week or a month or a year from now, right? Because I've lost that perspective of, hey, at the end of the road, what am I going to think about this decision or this challenge that I'm facing? So I think it's a very useful perspective, and I wanted to highlight it in this story because it's literally how Amazon got started, right? This is the perspective that gave Jeff Bezos the courage to go out and take the risk and actually start Amazon. If he hadn't looked through this decision, through this perspective from the very beginning, Amazon would never exist and not be the company that it is today. All right, moving on to story number 2. This is one of my absolute favorite examples of inversion. And so inversion is this idea, we covered it in podcast number 9 with Charlie Munger, but it's essentially taking whatever challenge or question you have in front of you and flipping it on its head and looking at it through a completely different lens. So an example would be if you're trying to figure out how to sell more of your product, then think through what are all the things you would do if you just wanted to not sell anything and completely destroy the company, and just make sure you don't do those things. Write out that list of all the things you would do to completely destroy the company and do not do those things. That's kind of what inversion means. And so, like I said, this example from Jeff Bezos is just incredible. And it's all about thinking long term. So here we go. Let's dive in. This is Jeff Bezos talking. He says, I very frequently get the question, what's going to change in the next 10 years? And that is a very interesting question. It's a very common one. I almost never get the question, what's not going to change in the next 10 years? And I submit to you that the second question is actually the more important of the two, because you can build a business strategy around the things that are stable in time. In our retail business, we know that customers want low prices. And I know that's going to be true 10 years from now. They want fast delivery. They want vast selection. It's impossible to imagine a future 10 years from now where a customer comes up and says, Jeff, I love Amazon. I just wish the prices were a little higher. Or I love Amazon. I just wish you'd deliver a little more slowly. Impossible. And so the effort we put into those things, spinning those things up, we know the energy we put into it today will still be paying off dividends for our customers 10 years from now. When you have something that you know is true, even over the long term, you can afford to put a lot of energy into it. So I just love this shift in perspective, this inversion that Jeff Bezos does with this question of, hey, what is going to change in the next 10 years, right? And one of the things that Amazon was absolutely notorious for was losing very large sums of money in the first years and even through the first decade, right? There's this one interview where someone asked Jeff Bezos, do you even know how to spell the word profit? And he has a hilarious answer. His answer is Prophet, right? And I think it's super interesting to think about the different bets he's made between Amazon Prime and 2-day shipping long before other people invested in that. AWS, all of these things, he's looking through this lens of, hey, what's not going to change in 10 years? I know that customers are going to want cheaper prices. I know they're going to want faster shipping. So I'm willing to invest heavily into those things because I know that they will stay consistent over time. And I know it's going to pay dividends in the long term. I may not know exactly what the profitability is going to look like in the next 2, 3, 5 years, but I know that in the long term, these things are going to pay off. And so he makes these really, really big bets. And so I just think it's really interesting, like I said, because he was notorious for losing so much money, which essentially means he was taking these really, really big bets on what they were doing, but he was comfortable with it because he was thinking long term, and that he knew in the long term these things were going to pay dividends because he was betting on things that were not going to change instead of betting on things that would change. So I thought that was really fascinating shift in perspective, and it's definitely something that I've tried to use in my business life as well. As like, hey, whenever I'm looking at a problem, hey, what are the things that are not going to change, and trying to optimize for those things. I love that perspective. All right, moving on to story number 3. This story is from the very early days of Amazon. We're talking like 1995 timeframe. And at this time, the employees and the employees' friends are really the main people who are writing the initial book reviews. And one of the decisions that Amazon makes is to allow negative reviews on their platform. So here we go, diving into the book. It says, naturally, some of the reviews were negative. In speeches, Bezos later recalled getting an angry letter from an executive at a book publisher, implying that Bezos didn't understand that his business was to sell books, not trash them. And here we go. Here's Bezos' thoughts. He says, we saw it very differently. When I read that letter, I thought, we don't make money when we sell things. We make money when we help customers make purchase decisions. So, like I said, I love these instances where we can see how someone who has been in the industry for a while, someone who's more traditional, thinks about this challenge or this question, and then how the person we are studying thinks about it through a different lens. And here is a very clear example of that. This executive from a publishing company says, hey, your job is to sell books. You don't understand your business. Your business is to sell books, not trash them. And Jeff Bezos says, no, my business is to help customers make purchase decisions. It is not to sell things. That is a very different perspective to have. It's a different lens to look at the problem through. And one of the things I was reminded of as I was thinking about this story is Naval Ravikant. We covered him on a podcast number 12. And in that podcast, we talk about ePinions, which was the company that he helped found in 1999. And that entire company was based on getting reviews for different products and different services. And they allowed negative reviews because it helped customers make purchasing decisions. So here we see Jeff Bezos 4 years ahead of ePinions and understanding the importance of reviews on their platform and the importance that it's going to have in helping customers make their purchase decisions. One of the quotes I really love from the book, and it's something that Jeff Bezos said, is Amazon isn't happening to the book business. The future is happening to the book business. So Jeff Bezos can see the impact that the internet is going to have, and that the information of both positive and negative reviews is going to help customers make purchasing decisions. And that is what is going to attract customers to their platform. At least one of the many things, along with, vast selection and fast shipping, that is going to pull people into using Amazon. So like I said, that's just another fascinating example of how Jeff Bezos' perspective on a particular challenge or question was vastly different than the existing executives in the business. All right, moving on to story number 4. This is a story from a little bit later in Amazon's history. It's from 2006, and it's talking about Amazon Web Service. So there's an interview in 2018, and I'd seen this interview before I started reading this book. And in that interview, Jeff Bezos is talking about how lucky Amazon was when they started AWS. So here we go. This is Jeff Bezos speaking. He said, at AWS, we completely reinvented the way that companies buy computation. Then a business miracle happened. This never happens. This is like the greatest piece of business luck in the history of business, so far as I know. We faced no like-minded competition for 7 years. It's unbelievable. When I launched Amazon.com in 1995, Barnes & Noble launched BarnesandNoble.com in 1997. 2 years. That's very typical if you invent something new. We launched Kindle, and the Barnes & Noble launched Nook 2 years later. We launched Echo, and Google launched Google Home 2 years later. When you pioneer, if you're lucky, you get a 2-year head start. Nobody gets a 7-year head start. So obviously, Jeff is talking here about how they had these 7 years of luck with AWS that they did not have to run into like-minded competition. But as I read this book, I got a little bit more insight into this story and how Jeff Bezos and Amazon made certain decisions that contributed to this luck, that contributed to this 7-year stint that they had with a lot less competition. So here we go, diving in on the book. It says, Bezos wanted AWS to be a utility with discount rates, even if that meant losing money in the short term. Willem van Biljon proposed pricing EC2, which is a product within AWS, proposed pricing EC2 instances at 15 cents an hour, a rate that he believed would allow the company to break even on the service. In an S-team meeting before EC2 launched, Bezos unilaterally revised that to 10 cents. So Bezos is going to change it from 15 cents to 10 cents. You realize you could lose money for a long time, Van Biljon told him. Great, Bezos said. So I'm going to pause right there. Essentially, Van Biljon is proposing that they price these EC2 instances at 15 cents an hour because he thinks that's going to allow Amazon to break even, just to at least cover their costs. And then Bezos is going to unilaterally come in. So he's going to make this decision on his own and change that to 10 cents. Here we go. Back to the book. It says Bezos believed his company had a natural advantage in its cost structure and ability to survive in the thin atmosphere of low margin businesses. Companies like IBM, Microsoft, and Google, he suspected, would hesitate to get into such markets because it would depress their overall profit margins. Bill Miller, the chief investment officer at Legg Mason Capital Management and a major Amazon shareholder, asked Bezos at the time about the profitability prospects for AWS. Bezos predicted they would be good over the long term, but said that he didn't want to repeat Steve Jobs' mistake of pricing the iPhone in a way that was so fantastically profitable that the smartphone market became a magnet for competition. The comment reflected his distinctive business philosophy. Bezos believed that high margins justified rivals' investments in research and development and attracted more competition. The comment reflected his distinctive business philosophy. Bezos believed that high margins justified rivals' investments in research and development and attracted more competition, while low margins attracted customers and were more defensible. So that's super interesting. You can already see here, Bezos has a different perspective. He says he has his distinctive business philosophy that Amazon is well positioned to operate in these low margin environments. Here we go, back to the book. It says Bezos's belief was borne out, and AWS's deliberately low rates had their intended effect. Google chairman Eric Schmidt said it was at least 2 years before he noticed that the founders of seemingly every startup he visited told him they were building their systems atop Amazon servers. All of a sudden, it was all Amazon, Schmidt said. It's a significant benefit when every interesting, fast-growing company starts on your platform. Microsoft announced a similar cloud initiative called Azure in 2010, and in 2012, Google announced its own compute engine. Let's give them credit, Schmidt says. The book guys got computer science, they figured out the analytics, and they built something significant. So I love this story, right? So there's this question, how much are we going to charge for AWS? And there's a few different questions you can ask in there that will give you a different perspective on how you're going to approach the problem, right? You can approach the question as, hey, how do we maximize our profits in whatever it is, 1 year, 2 years, whatever time horizon you may have? There's the question of, hey, how much do we need to charge just to break even on this thing? And that's what Van Billion comes and proposes initially with the 15 cents. And then Jeff Bezos looks at it through a different lens. Hey, how do we price it so that we don't attract competition to come in and compete with us, right? And so I just thought this was a fascinating story. Jeff Bezos has a different perspective on how to price it and why to price it that way. And before I'd read this book, I thought it was, hey, 7 years of luck. But as you read this story, you realize that, hey, I'm sure there was some luck involved, but it was also somewhat by design. They had priced it in a way to intentionally make it to where they did not attract competition in the space. So I thought that was just a fascinating story that contributed to Amazon Web Services being as successful as it was. And as we've been talking about this entire podcast, that perspective from Jeff Bezos that's just different from how everyone else is thinking of it. Instead of thinking about the margins and the profit in the short term, thinking through the lens of, hey, how do we approach this to where we're not attracting competition? And another thing, and this is something I'm sure I'll cover on future podcasts, but this is just another story that highlights Jeff's long-term thinking. He's always talking about long-term thinking. If you listen to anything from Jeff Bezos, you're probably going to hear him talk about long-term thinking and how Amazon thinks long-term. And this is definitely an example of pricing AWS to where, hey, I don't know what the profits are going to look like in the short term, but over the long term, this is going to work out for us. All right, moving on to story number 5. This is a theme that we've touched on previous podcasts, especially the Steve Jobs podcast, but this idea of not being scared to cannibalize yourself. So this story is from 2004, and it's talking about the Kindle. And so there's a character in this story. His name's Steve Kessel, and he joined Amazon in 1999, and he was in charge of the book category. So he was in charge of the physical books and making sure those are getting sold on Amazon, and he has gained a whole lot of leadership capital with Jeff Bezos. He's somebody that Jeff Bezos has a whole lot of trust in. So here we go, diving in on the book. It says, one day in 2004, Bezos called Kessel into his office and abruptly took away his impressive job with all of its responsibilities and subordinates. He said he wanted Kessel to take over Amazon's fledgling digital efforts. Kessel was skeptical, and then this is Kessel speaking. My first reaction was that I already had the best job in the world. Ultimately, Jeff talked about building brand new things, and I got excited by the challenge. Bezos was adamant that Kessel could not run both the physical and digital media businesses at the same time. If you're running both businesses, you will never go after the digital opportunity with tenacity, Jeff said. By that time, Bezos and his executives had devoured and rapidly discussed another book that would significantly affect the company's strategy, The Innovator's Dilemma by Harvard professor Clayton Christensen. So I want to pause right there. A little bit of context to add is Bezos and the executive team had a book club meeting every Saturday morning. So they are getting after it. They are meeting on Saturday mornings to talk about the books that they've read and understand what they can learn from those, how they can change their perspective from what they've learned in the books, and use that to change their actions within Amazon. And that's what we are going to see here. Jeff is going to take his learnings from this book, The Innovator's Dilemma, and apply it to this project for the Kindle. Here we go, back to the book. It says, Christensen wrote that great companies fail not because they want to avoid disruptive change, but because they are reluctant to embrace promising new markets that might undermine their traditional businesses and that do not appear to satisfy their short-term growth requirements. Sears, for example, failed to move from department stores to discount retailing. IBM couldn't shift from mainframe to mini computers. The companies that solved the innovator's dilemma, Christensen wrote, succeeded when they set up autonomous organizations charged with building new and independent businesses around the disruptive technology. So that's exactly what Jeff Bezos is doing here. He's having Kessel start an autonomous and independent business around the Kindle, around digital books. Here we go, back to the book. It says, drawing lessons directly from the book, Bezos unshackled Kessel from Amazon's traditional media organization. Your job is to kill your own business, Jeff told him. I want you to proceed as if your goal is to put everyone selling physical books out of a job. Bezos underscored the urgency of the effort. He believed that if Amazon didn't lead the world into the age of digital reading, then Apple or Google would. When Kessel asked Bezos what his deadline was on developing the company's first piece of hardware, an electronic reading device, Bezos told him, you are basically already late. So I love this story. This is another example of Jeff Bezos being willing to cannibalize part of his own business because he sees where the future is going, right? We already talked about the quote, Amazon isn't happening to the book business. The future is happening to the book business. He sees that the future is about to happen to Amazon. Digital books are going to have an impact and it's going to affect the sales of physical books. And he is willing to create this separate division within Amazon that is focused on digital books. And he's actually going to take the guy who is leading the physical book department and put him on the Kindle project to make sure that he goes and crushes it. And he says, your job is to kill your own business. So I just thought that story was fascinating and really thought it was fascinating to see how Jeff Bezos is actively seeking ways to change his perspective. He's reading these books. He's making his executive team have these book club meetings with the intention on gaining new perspectives on how to approach the challenges they're facing and making sure that Amazon is set to succeed in the long term. So like I said, just absolutely love that story. I really think it hits on that theme of perspective is worth 80 IQ points. All right, story number 6. This is the last one we're going to cover today. And this is a story from December of 2011. And I absolutely love it because it's a memo written by Jeff Bezos that's going to allow us to see how he thinks and the thought process that he goes through to get to the different perspectives that he has. So like I said, it's the end of 2011. And Amazon does this big promotion for this price comparison app that's going to allow users to take pictures or scan the barcodes of products in the stores and compare them to the price on Amazon. And they even go to the point where they offer discounts for buying things through Amazon instead of at the store that the person's at. So this is going to create an avalanche of criticism for Amazon. And this is kind of to the point where Amazon's getting big and it's kind of being viewed as, big brother who's putting small mom and pop shops out of business. And so during this time, Jeff is trying to think through this question of when Amazon becomes a company with $100 billion in sales, how can it be loved instead of feared? So that is the question he's trying to answer. And we're going to get the chance to see this memo of him essentially talking out loud. So here we go, diving in on the book. It says, as he regularly does, Bezos wrote up his thoughts in a memo and distributed it to his top executives at an S-team retreat. The memo, which Bezos titled Amazon.love, lays out a vision for how the Amazon founder wants his company to conduct itself and be perceived by the world. It reflects Bezos' values and determination, and perhaps even his blind spots. So here we go. This is a quote from the memo. Jeff writes, some big companies develop ardent fan bases, are widely loved by their customers, and are even perceived as cool. For different reasons in different ways and to different degrees, companies like Apple, Nike, Disney, Google, Whole Foods, Costco, and even UPS strike me as examples of large companies that are well liked by their customers. On the other end of the spectrum, he added, companies like Walmart, Microsoft, Goldman Sachs, and ExxonMobil tended to be feared. Bezos postulated that the second set of companies was viewed perhaps unfairly as engaging in exploitative behavior. He wondered why Microsoft's large base of users had never come out in any significant way to defend the company against its critics, and speculated that perhaps customers were simply not satisfied with its products. I'm going to pause right there. Sorry. I wish so bad I could see the raw version of this memo. I know Brad Stone, the author of the book, is summarizing it here, but man, I wish I could see the raw version of this memo. Here we go. Back to the book. He theorized that UPS, though not particularly inventive, was blessed by having the unsympathetic U.S. Postal Service as a competitor. Walmart had to deal with a plethora of sympathetic competitors in the small downtown stores it competed with. But Bezos was dissatisfied with that simplistic conclusion and applied his usual analytic sensibility to parse out why some companies were loved and others feared. And here we go. This is quoted from the memo. Rudeness is cool. Defeating tiny guys is not cool. Close following is not cool. Young is cool. Risk-taking is cool. Winning is cool. Polite is cool. Defeating bigger, unsympathetic guys is cool. Inventing is cool. Explorers are cool. Conquerors are not cool. Obsessing over competitors is not cool. Empowering others is cool. Capturing all the value only for the company is not cool. Leadership is cool. Conviction is cool. Straightforwardness is cool. Pandering to the crowd is not cool. Hypocrisy is not cool. Authenticity is cool. Thinking big is cool. The unexpected is cool. Missionaries are cool. Mercenaries are not cool. And here we go. This is back to Brad Stevens' writing. It says, on an attached spreadsheet, Bezos listed 17 attributes, including polite, reliable, risk-taking, and thinks big, and he ranked a dozen companies on each particular characteristic. I love how much he's studying here. He's putting so much effort into this analysis. He's asking himself this question of how do we become a loved company or stay a loved company when we have $100 billion in sales. And what does he do? He does a ton of research. He's looking into all these different competitors and these different companies in these different industries, and he's attributing all these characteristics to them and trying to think about which ones are cool, which ones aren't, and why are the ones that are cool, and why are the ones that are not cool, right? So the takeaway for me here, one of the takeaways is these unique perspectives that Jeff Bezos gets along the way that allows him to make these really important decisions with the business. It's, for me, it's really interesting to see these are not perspectives that he just has a unique insight on that he was born with or just naturally came to him. He is actively studying and actively seeking all of this different information and reading history and studying these companies to allow him to gain the perspective that's going to allow him to be smarter and make better decisions and have 80 more IQ points. I just love how much effort he's putting into trying to gain all of these different perspectives. So back to the book. It says his methodology was highly subjective, he conceded, but his conclusions laid out at the end of the Amazon.love memo were aimed at increasing Amazon's odds of standing out among the loved companies. Being polite and reliable or customer obsessed was not sufficient. Being perceived as inventive, as an explorer rather than a conqueror, was critically important. And this is Jeff Bezos talking. He writes, I actually believe the 4 unloved companies are inventive as a matter of substance, but they are not perceived as inventors and pioneers. It is not enough to be inventive. That pioneering spirit must also come across and be perceivable by the customer base. I propose that one outcome from this offsite could be to assign a more thorough analysis of this topic to a thoughtful VP. we may be able to find actionable tasks that will increase our odds of being a standout in that first group of companies. So, like I said, I just love this section because it shows you how much effort Jeff Bezos is putting in to gaining these different perspectives. He's studying these companies. He's trying to understand what makes them loved. He goes through and lists out all of these attributes and ranks all these different companies to figure out which ones are effective so that they can go study those companies to see what they can learn from them. So I just love that. There's this quote earlier in the book from someone, it was a colleague that Jeff Bezos worked at. I believe it was at D.E. Shaw, but one of the comments he made was Jeff Bezos went to school on everybody. So whether it was an individual he met or a company, he just was ruthlessly studying, and that's what we see here. So he's just very disciplined in his thinking to be creative and come up with these different ways to look at the challenges and problems he faces. So I just absolutely love that. And so that's the 6 stories. So that's where we're going to wrap up these 6 stories that I think highlight this idea that perspective is worth 80 IQ points, and showing some of the ways that Jeff and Amazon look at different situations that led them to make the decisions that they made that built Amazon to the company that it is today. And like I said, this book is littered with tens or probably even hundreds of more examples of Jeff Bezos' unique perspective on different situations. So definitely get the book. Like I said, it's called The Everything Store. It's written by Brad Stone. This one that I got was published in 2013, but I do know that Brad Stone came out with not an updated version. I guess he wrote, I'll call it a sequel to this book. I want to say he published that in the 2020s. So it's got at least a decade more of stories from Amazon and Jeff Bezos in there. So I'm definitely going to get that at some point and check out that book. And so with that, I'm going to close out this podcast, and I will see you all next time.